The costumes, the hair. There's only one ABBA. And after decades of going their own way, the Swedish supergroup is back.
He wrote the music behind one of the best-selling bands in history, sold hundreds of millions of records, and yet for decades he let his songwriting partner and two singers take the spotlight while he stayed at the piano. Now, in his late 70s, Benny Andersson has spent the last years of his career finally putting on record what fans had quietly suspected for a long time, that the man behind ABBA's sound was never chasing fame at all, and that the story of the band is far more complicated and far more human than the glossy pop image ever let on. This is that story, built entirely from what Benny himself, his bandmates, and decades of documented history have actually said. Göran Bror Benny Andersson was born on the 16th of December, 1946, in the Vasasten district of Stockholm, to a civil engineer father and a mother who worked at home. He had one younger sister. Long before there was any hint of a global pop group, there was an accordion. Both his father and his grandfather Ephraim were enthusiastic amateur players, and Swedish folk music filled the Andersson household from the time Benny was a small child. At 6 years old, his family bought him his own accordion and introduced him to the folk and traditional tunes that would quietly shape his musical instincts for the rest of his life. He has said he had maybe 1 or 2 formal music lessons as a boy, and that he found them boring. Everything else, he taught himself by ear and by trial and error, the same way he would go on to work in the studio decades later. His first real taste of fame came not with ABBA, but more than a decade earlier, with a Swedish rock group called the Hepstars. Benny joined as keyboardist in October 1964, and the band quickly became one of the biggest acts in Scandinavia, sometimes nicknamed the Swedish Beatles. It was here that Benny began writing his own songs, starting with a track called No Response, and then his first genuine hit, Sunny Girl, which caught attention even outside Sweden. For a few years in the mid to late 60s, this teenage keyboard player from Stockholm was already living the strange, disorienting experience of being recognized on the street, long before the word ABBA existed. It was on the road with the Hepstars in June 1966 that Benny met a young musician named Björn Ulvaeus. The two started writing songs together almost immediately, beginning with a track called Isn't It Easy to Say, which the Hepstars recorded. That meeting turned into one of the most enduring songwriting partnerships in pop music history, one that would eventually last more than 50 years. By the spring of 1969, Benny and Björn had scored their first real hits as a songwriting duo, writing for other Swedish performers before ever performing together themselves. It was also in 1969 that the personal side of the story began to take shape. At the Swedish Melodifestival and Song Contest that year, where Benny had submitted an entry with another songwriting partner, he met a singer named Annifrid Lingstad, known to the world simply as Frida. Around the same time, Björn met a young solo singer named Agnetha Faltskog. Two songwriters and two singers, all involved with each other, began supporting one another in the studio almost by accident. In 1970, Benny and Björn recorded an album called Liquor, and asked their girlfriends to come in and provide backing vocals. The blend of voices was striking enough that it changed the direction of everything that followed. As Benny later put it, when they heard the four voices together for the first time, it was one of those moments where you simply think, wow, they sound good, we don't. That accidental discovery pushed Björn to suggest they try writing pop music in English and performing as a group. Their first song under that new direction was released in 1972 and became a hit. To introduce themselves to an audience beyond Sweden, the four of them entered the Eurovision Song Contest, and on the 6th of April, 1974, they won it outright with Waterloo. That single night in Brighton changed the trajectory of all four of their lives. Interestingly, despite being one half of the songwriting engine behind nearly every song the group ever released, Benny sang lead vocal on only a single ABBA track in the group's entire career, a song called Susa Hangaround from the Waterloo album. From that point on, the four distinctive voices belonged to Agnetha and Frida, while Benny worked mostly out of view, shaping the chords, the arrangements, and the productions that carried those voices. Over the next 8 years, Benny and Björn wrote and produced 8 studio albums together as ABBA became one of the most commercially successful groups in the world, eventually selling several 100 million records. Behind the four friendly faces on stage, though, real life was moving in a very different direction than the song suggested. Benny had actually become a father very young, at 16, well before ABBA existed, and he has said in later interviews that although he considered himself mature for his age at the time, it was not an easy situation, especially once touring took him away from home for long stretches. He has openly said he regrets that part of those years, even while acknowledging that things worked out well with his children in the long run. The relationship between Benny and Frida followed the group's fame closely, and just as closely, it followed the group's cracks. The couple had been together since 1969 and living together from 1971, but they didn't marry until October 6, 1978, at the very height of ABBA's global success. It lasted only 2 years. They separated in November of 1980 and divorced in 1981. At the time, in an interview with the Swedish press, Benny said simply that he didn't know how other people handled things like that, but that he and Frida were still friends and still bandmates, even though they were no longer married. Frida, for her part, said publicly that their personal relationship had actually become easier once the marriage ended, because the intensity that had once complicated their work together had eased. Around the same period, Bjorn and Agnetha's own marriage, which had also been formed in the earliest days of the group, ended in divorce as well. 2 marriages, both born inside the same 4-person band, both dissolving within roughly a year of each other, while the group kept recording and touring as if the machine simply couldn't stop. It's worth being honest about what is actually known here and what isn't. Tabloids at the time speculated relentlessly about the reasons behind both divorces, and some of that speculation has hardened into accepted trivia over the decades. What's actually on the record is more restrained. Benny remarried the following year, in 1981, to Swedish television presenter Mona Norklit, and the two have remained married ever since, going on to have a son, Ludwig, who today works alongside his father producing projects connected to ABBA's legacy. Whatever pain existed around the original divorce, both Benny and Frida chose, publicly at least, to describe it as amicable, and by all documented accounts the two of them, along with Bjorn and Agnetha, kept their working friendship intact well beyond the group's active years. By the early 80s, ABBA's momentum had genuinely started to slow. Their final album together, The Visitors, released in 1981, sold nowhere near as well as its predecessors. There was no dramatic on-camera breakup, no farewell tour, no joint statement calling it quits. The group simply stopped releasing new music together after 1982, and each member drifted into separate projects, with the assumption in the press, and largely among fans, that ABBA was over, even though nobody ever formally announced it that way. For Benny, what came next wasn't retirement, and it wasn't hiding from a broken band. It was a fairly immediate pivot into a different kind of composing. He and Bjorn's first major project after ABBA was the stage musical Chess, written together with lyricist Tim Rice. The concept album, released in 1984 with vocals from performers including Tommy Korberg, Murray Head, Elaine Page, and Barbara Dixon, sold roughly 2 million copies worldwide and produced 2 enduring hits, One Night in Bangkok and I Know Him So Well. Chess opened in London's West End in 1986 to a mixed but largely positive reception and ran for about 3 years, though a reworked Broadway version 2 years later struggled and closed within 2 months. Decades later, in 2025, a new Broadway revival of Chess was produced, with Benny's son Ludwig among its producers, a small full-circle detail that connects the earliest post-ABBA project directly to the present day. Through the 80s and 90s, Benny kept working steadily, often outside the pop spotlight entirely, composing for Swedish theatre and orchestral projects, including the musical Kristina Fran Duva Mahler, written with Bjorn and based on a set of classic Swedish emigration novels. This period gave him something ABBA's pop machine rarely had, room to write without 4 competing public personas standing in front of the music. In 2001, he formed his own band, Benny Andersson's Orchestra, a large ensemble rooted deliberately in the same Swedish folk tradition his father and grandfather had introduced him to as a child. That band has continued touring in Sweden for over 2 decades, playing long, dancehall-style sets built around Swedish folk and dance music rather than international pop. That same year, 2001, marks another turning point Benny has spoken about candidly, though only much later. He had struggled with alcohol through much of his adult life, and in 2001 he stopped drinking entirely, becoming and remaining a teetotaler. He didn't discuss the extent of that struggle publicly until a 2011 interview, nearly a decade into his sobriety, when he described giving up drinking as one of the best decisions he ever made, one that he says allowed him to feel physically capable and present in a way he hadn't been before. It's a detail that complicates the tidy image of the cheerful, background genius of ABBA considerably more honestly than any invented confession could. As the decades went on, Benny also became more publicly vocal about causes he cares about, something is attributed simply to getting older and paying closer attention to the world. He's spoken about supporting gender equality initiatives and has been a financial supporter of Sweden's Feminist Initiative Party. He's also talked about coming from a family that didn't have much money, and about the years before ABBA when all 4 future members had to take ordinary jobs just to pay rent, a detail that undercuts any idea that his path to success was easy or guaranteed. Perhaps the most consistent theme in what Benny has actually said over the years, in multiple separate interviews across different decades, is how surprised he still is that any of it worked at all, and how important the friendship among the 4 of them turned out to be, regardless of who was married to whom. At ABBA's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2010, standing on stage with his former wife Frida, Benny reflected on where the group's melancholy undertone actually came from, tracing it back to the long dark winters of Sweden and the folk and classical traditions of Scandinavian and Russian composers, the same soil that had shaped him as a 6-year-old with an accordion decades earlier. He's also said, in more than one interview, that none of the 4 of them ever expected the songs to still matter this many decades later, and that the ongoing friendship between all 4 members, even after 2 marriages inside the band ended, is something he considers genuinely rare. That friendship became visible to the wider world again far more dramatically than anyone expected. In 2021, decades after most fans assumed ABBA was permanently finished, the group announced new music and a groundbreaking virtual concert residency called ABBA Voyage, featuring digital avatars of all 4 members performing alongside a live band, a project Benny has described as both a huge technical undertaking and a genuine honor to be part of, precisely because it required them to be first movers with a technology nobody had used at this scale before. His son Ludwig became one of the producers behind that show, tying the earliest chapters of Benny's life, the accordion, the folk tunes, the studio obsession, directly into one of the most technologically ambitious concert experiences ever built. What makes Benny Andersson's story compelling isn't a scandal that was hidden and is now being revealed. It's something quieter and, in a way, more relatable. It's the story of someone who spent his career as the architect behind other people's voices, who became a father before he was out of his teens, whose first marriage dissolved at the height of his public success just as his songwriting partners did, who struggled privately with drinking for years before saying anything about it publicly, and who nonetheless kept building, kept composing, kept showing up to write music for the rest of his life, from Swedish folk halls to Broadway to a hologram concert in London. He never stopped being, in his own words from years back, the guy who looked into the eyes of his old bandmates and recognized something rare that most people never get to experience with anyone. That's the story the facts actually support, and in many ways it needs no exaggeration. A teenager with an oversized accordion from a working Stockholm family became one half of the songwriting engine behind one of the best-selling groups the world has ever known, lived through the same kind of personal upheaval as millions of ordinary people, and kept making music through every version of himself, right through his 70s. What we always suspected, it turns out, was simpler and truer than any manufactured confession could ever be. That behind the ABBA machine was just a person, shaped by folk songs and a hard winter sky, who never really stopped being that boy with the accordion. If you enjoyed learning the real story behind the music, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.